Last time we looked at the way the Lord protected and prepared the baby abandoned in a basket in the river for a far greater purpose in life than this bad beginning may have suggested. And after 40 years in Egypt, now 40 years in Midian, we come to the decisive moment that sets Moses off on his decisive role in life. Today we're looking at the calling of Moses in Exodus 3, right through to chapter 4, verse 17, an awe-inspiring narrative at a pivotal moment in biblical history. This passage then deals with Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush, where God commissions him to lead the Israelites into their redemption and out of Egypt. And the basic shape of it goes like this. You get the initiation of the encounter. God reveals himself and begins dealing with Moses. Then there's a commissioning. God assigns Moses his mission. And then Moses has objections and God reassures him a little bit. Moses presents those objections. God responds with reassurance and provisions for the task. And then you get the obedience and preparation phase. Moses accepts the mission, prepares for it and begins the journey. There's the headlines. But that ignores the big X factor in what we're being told, how we're being told it, and its powerful significance here. Remember the trajectory of Moses' life up to this point. A baby born under oppression and genocide, abandoned in a basket, made great by human strength and power as an adopted prince of Egypt, but dropped like a rock for his righteous indignation at the injustice meted out to his people, God's people, and then a fugitive in a foreign land feeding sheep for the way he'd expressed his passion for justice in Egypt. God's about to do for his own people what no human can do for them, even a prince in Egypt, because this world's glory is not only skin deep, but rapidly fades. You can't ignore the context, you see, of the trajectory of Moses' life to date. And therefore the big thing, as I see it here, is that we're being told a phenomenal, epic, mind-blowing, inspiring, powerful story of how God takes weak and incapable human beings and by giving them a clear vision of his glory and a commission to do his will, inspires and empowers them to attempt to do awesome things in his service. Things they could never otherwise have done, by inspiring them with a vision of his greatness and glory. And when God drops on us a story like that in Scripture, it's normally happening because the sheer awe that the story evokes is meant fundamentally to do something to us. What this gives us is not so much cognitive instruction, facts in your head, but affective learning. It affects us. The powerful impression is being made on our characters, not mainly by the cognitive instruction that's being given us in the story, but by the impact and change it makes on us at a heart level. And from the point of modifying our behaviour and our faithful disposition of life, that's a powerful thing to do. What am I going on about here? You know, when you watch one of the epics of the classical era of action-adventure movies like the Star Wars movies or Raiders of the Lost Ark, we're back to 1981 there, my examples are dating me a bit here, or Die Hard 1988. Those movies do something to you at a deep level. You want to go out and save the world, right? They are epic entertainment, but they impact your emotions and your thought patterns and your heart. And it's your heart that motivates your will. These things inspire you. But throughout Old Testament and New Testament history, right up until arguably the 1980s, you haven't got action-adventure films like the new Hollywood films of the 1980s and 1990s to do that to you. Instead, for millennia, God's people only had amazingly well-written and powerfully delivered inspiring stories of God's dealings with his people. And to this day, when those stories are done, performed, told, the way they were intended to be done by their human and divine authors, that's what they do to you. They inspire you. They put steel into you. The godly courage born of inspired faith. They empower you to the heroism of faith through some clear theme in the life of the hero or heroine or whoever. But before we can just jump to that, we need to look at the structure of the story. Well, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the story, and it goes something like this. You get the introduction in chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. Verse 1, the narrative setting, that the passage begins with Moses tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, on the western side of the desert near Horeb, the mountain of God. Horeb actually is another name for what came to be known as Mount Sinai. And there's a good deal of foreshadowing in this verse because, of course, Mount Sinai is a place where Moses goes later when he's shepherding not sheep but the people of Israel. And he leads them to Mount Sinai to receive the law. It's a big stage in the development of their relationship with God. But this sets the scene then for the divine encounter. He's on the western side of the desert and he goes to Mount Horeb, future Sinai. And then in verses 2 to 4, God appears. The angel of the Lord appears to Moses in a flame of fire within a bush. Now the angel of the Lord crops up across the early chapters of the Bible. He's occurred in Genesis already, chapter 16, chapter 21, chapter 22. There's some ambiguity in the expression, but it seems often to be interchangeable with God's name itself, showing that it refers to the Lord. And here, Genesius classifies the Hebrew construction as a beit essentiae, which would then indicate that Yahweh appeared to Moses as a flame. The fire's within the bush, but the bush isn't burned naturally then, although the bush is burning within. It's not consumed because it's the visual representation of the eternal God, not an incident of combustion. And fire frequently accompanies the revelation of Yahweh, of the covenant God, Jehovah if you like, in Exodus, as he delivers Israel, as he guides Israel, as he purifies her. Now we've got this description here, it's unique. It's calling attention to the manifestation as a flame of fire from within that bush. And that's identified with the angel of the Lord. And it's not that being consumed aspect of what he sees that draws Moses' attention. Moses, having looked into things then, the bush seemed, well, it had a fire within it, but it wasn't being consumed. He gets curious. And he wants to know more. And it's that looking into things that triggers God calling Moses by name. Now Moses obviously responds, verse 3. So Moses thought, I'll turn aside to see this amazing sight. Why does this bush not burn up? Verb's an imperfect. Here it has a progressive sort of nuance. The bush is not going on burning up. And it's Moses' interest that stimulates the Lord's next act. Verse 4, when the Lord saw it, he turned aside to look. God called to him from within the bush. He said, Moses, Moses. And there's God's repetition of personally calling to Moses, indicating urgency. Something big is about to go down. Moses, hey, Moses. And in verses 5 and 6, of course, yeah, it does. Holy ground and revelation. Even though the Lord was drawing near to Moses, Moses could not casually approach God. There's still this barrier between the holy God and sinful humanity. And God had to remind Moses of this with some specific instructions. Get your shoes off. Now, it's not as simple as that. This is not like when your mum catches you coming into the kitchen with your outside boots on. The removal of sandals was, in the ancient Near East, a sign, still is in the East, a sign of humility and reverence in the presence of the Holy One. It was a way of excluding the dust and dirt of the world. But it also took away personal comfort and convenience and brought the person more closely into contact with the realities of the earth, I guess. So God instructs Moses to remove his sandals because the ground is holy. Kodesh, holy, means set apart, distinct, unique. And it was the fact that God chose that place to reveal himself or to appear there amongst his people that made it holy, that set it apart. It wasn't some ritual or other, it was God was there. Because God was in this place, the ground was different. It was holy. Take your shoes off. And when they've been through that reminder, God then identifies himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when he does so, Moses hides his face out of fear. This self-revelation by the covenant God prepares for the revelation of the holy name of God. Now, no verb is used in that revelation. The pronoun, the predicate, nominative are a construction used throughout Scripture to convey the I am disclosures. I am the God of. But the significant point here is the naming of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. For this God is the covenant God who will fulfill his promises. It's going to be important. God then, who would cut a covenant with his people, is a covenant-keeping God. And the next section then develops that theme as Moses gets commissioned for the task that will see God keeping faith, keeping his covenant with his people, his Hebrew people, who are currently, of course, slaving in Egypt as this incident unfolds. Okay, then there's the setting of the scene, there's the introduction of what's happening. And then, secondly, God commissions Moses in verses 7 to 10 of chapter 3 of Exodus. The Lord says, I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sorrows. I've come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a land that is both good and spacious, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the region of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites and Jebusites. Quite a lot. And now indeed, the cry of the Israelites has come to me. And I've also seen how severely the Egyptians oppressed them. So now go, and I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. A lot going on there. Firstly, there's the testimony from the Lord that whatever his people are going through down there in Egypt, their covenant-keeping God sees and cares. Chapter 3, verses 7 to 9, you've got this divine awareness and compassion. God expresses his awareness of the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt. He hasn't forgotten. It's not that he's not seen. And having seen, his compassion is moved, and he declares his intention to deliver them from oppression, to bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. Not just deliverance, it's redemption. Well, secondly, then, in this awesome setting, there's the statement of what the covenant-keeping God intends to do about the situation that he's seen and felt compassion for. And that intimately involves Moses, verses 3 to 10. There's this commissioning of Moses. God directly commissions Moses. You're going to go to Pharaoh and you're going to bring the Israelites back out of Egypt. Yeah, sounds easy, doesn't it? Hostage release is one of the more complicated things that military operators get to do. More risky than most. The most unconventional plan has been laid for this rescue as well. And of course, hostage rescue doesn't always go well. God isn't sending an elite force, you see. He's sending an 80-year-old shepherd with many things going on that disable him from being good at it. We'll see in a minute. And then there's the climax of God's direct address to Moses. So now go, I'll send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And funnily enough, Moses has got a full set of objections, 4 or 5, any one of which would seem to me to be completely fair enough. So we've had the scene set. There's God appearing in the burning of this bush, or not the burning of the bush, but burning within the bush not being consumed. And then there's this awesome statement there about what the covenant-keeping God is going to do about the situation in Egypt. And now we come to Moses' objections and God's responses in Exodus 3:11 to 4:17. First objection, chapter 3 of Exodus, verses 11 and 12. Moses pleads his inadequacy. He questions his own adequacy for the task. He just says, who am I for this? Now hang on, because Moses was full of confidence back in Egypt. But now the imperfect tense, elech, carries the modal nuance of obligatory and perfect. Who am I that I should go? Moses at this point is overwhelmed with the task of representing God and with his personal insufficiency for it. And so in honest humility, he questions God's choice. Who am I for that? And God reassures him with the promise of his presence and gives Moses a sign. The people will worship God on this mountain after their deliverance. And of course, we know they do, because we've read the rest of the book, right? We know they're going to end up at Mount Sinai and God's going to renew his covenant and give them the law and so on. There's the first objection. I'm inadequate. Who am I for this? Second objection, chapter 3, verses 13 to 22. This objection now has to do with how he can lay claim to God's authority and identity to back up this unwelcome commission when he goes back to the people in Egypt. He's afraid of going down to Egypt, telling the Hebrews the score and getting the same sort of response he had way back in the day from the Hebrew slave chapter. Remember him beating up on the fellow Hebrew, chapter 2, verse 14? Who made you a prince and judge over us? People challenging his authority to do, you see. Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? That guy said. Who made you prince and judge over us? Moses anticipates the Israelites questioning him about that. And God reveals his name as I am who I am and provides Moses with a detailed plan, including how Pharaoh will eventually let the Israelites go. I am who I am. I'll be with you. It's enough. Well, Moses has got a third objection. Fear of unbelief. Moses doubts the Israelites will believe him. It's not just that he's afraid they're going to say, who are you? He's got this fear of unbelief, the third objection. And God gives him 3 miraculous signs to deal with that. God says, throw your stick on the ground, and it turns into a serpent. He says, pick it up by the tail. That's a more difficult task than throwing your stick down, isn't it? And he does, and it turns back into a staff. And God says, put your hand in your jacket, and his hand turns leprous. And God says, put it in again, and he pulls it out, and God has healed it. And then there's turning water into blood. I've puzzled my head a bit about these 3 signs. I found the names, of at least 6 snake gods in ancient Egypt, representing everything from chaos to medicine, judgment, and forgiveness. Perhaps more significantly in this context, the Egyptian serpent god Apep, big cheese amongst ancient Egyptian gods, was the god of life and death, particularly death, I think. Snakes were big in that old Egyptian religion. But Moses will be given power to create a snake out of an ordinary shepherd's staff, and most significantly also to turn it back again to accredit his commission from God. To do and undo this great, powerful, so-called Egyptian god with death in his hands. Incidentally, the most common use of the word used here for a serpent occurs in the account of Eve and the serpent in Genesis 3 at the fall. That's where we see most of it up until now in the Bible, but make of that what you will. The second authority conferring sign involves putting a hand in your cloak, pulling it out with white disease. White disease. What our English versions call leprosy. And this sudden skin disease indicated God was able to bring such diseases on Egypt in the plagues, and that only he could remove them. Now we need to be a bit careful here, because the Hebrew words traditionally rendered leprous or leprosy, as they are in Leviticus 13 and 14, those words encompass a wide variety of conditions, not limited to the disease called leprosy, identified as Hansen's disease in more modern times now. Significant, it seems to me, in this context, deadly serpent represented by the ancient god of life and death, is the knowledge that this whitening was considered to be the first stage of death for the diseased. Numbers 12:10, 2 Kings 5:27, and so on. First sign of death. And there's Moses, in the name of God, being able to exercise control there, as he was with the serpent. And then the third authority-conferring sign is a foretaste of the amazingly powerful sign Moses will later perform for Pharaoh, when at his command the Nile is turned to blood. What's that about? The Nile was always known as a source of life for Egypt, and now it will become the evidence of death as it runs blood red. Can you see a theme in all of this? We clearly have 3 signs which are alike, each consisting of life and death. They clearly anticipate the struggle with Egypt through the plagues, of course, But the point is clear that in the face of the possibility that people might not believe, the servants of God must offer clear proof of the power of God as they deliver the message of God. And here he is, delivering signs, learning to deliver signs, being given confidence to deliver signs that concern issues of life and death. And the penalty for rebelling against God's authority, expressing that authority through a weak human spokesman being the point here. Rebelling against God's authority is all very much tied up with the wages of sin being death, but the free gift of God being life itself. Well, that objection's been pretty well dealt with. The third objection. Let's have a look at the fourth in chapter 4, verses 10 to 12. Moses protests that he is slow of speech and tongue. He's got a speech impediment, he says. There are two expressions there in the Hebrew, heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. You're getting the general drift anyway, aren't you? Moses is saying he's got a problem speaking well. I'm supposed to go down there and tell these people and lead these people out. I'm a terrible orator. Well, perhaps he'd been too long on the other side of the desert and his language skills had slipped, he thought, or perhaps he was being a little bit coy. We just don't know. At any rate, he has still not captured the meaning, the significance of God's presence with him. It's not your oratorical skills that are going to get you anywhere, Moses. And God assures him he will help him speak and teach him what to say. The point here is that God's servants must yield themselves as instruments to God, the Creator. Makes no difference what character traits they have or what weaknesses they think they have. Moses manages to speak perfectly well to do the job because God was present with him. And if the sovereign God has chosen those people and he is with them, they have everything that God intended them to have. Moses is kind of out of objection, so he flings a desperate fifth in chapter 4, verses 13 to 17, with this plea, please, Lord, just send somebody else. Some of us might identify with that. Can't somebody else do it, please? And now God's anger is kindled. God's had enough. But he accommodates Moses again by appointing Aaron, Moses' brother, as his spokesperson. And the rest is history. God reaffirms his support and provides further instructions. And here we get Moses now just falling in with those final preparations for his service in Exodus 4, 17 onwards, I guess, 18 onwards. Chapter 4, verses 18 to 20, Moses returns to Egypt. After this extensive dialogue there upon Mount Horeb, Moses returns to Jethro and receives permission to return to Egypt, and he sets out with his family. And God reassures Moses of his mission's success, reinforcing his resolve. And then chapter 21 to 23, there's God's foreknowledge and God's warning. God instructs Moses about what to do before Pharaoh, foretells Pharaoh's obstinance. Look, Moses, this is what you're getting into. I'm with you. And God reveals that at that point he's going to strike Egypt's firstborn as a judgment. But there's one more thing to get out of the way. In chapter 4, verses 24 to 26, Moses is not living within that covenant. And the narrative takes a sudden turn with the incident at the lodging place. God seeks to kill Moses for his failure to keep a covenant, and Zipporah's quick action there, verses 24 to 26, save the day. Covenant obedience is important in having God with you. And that's the key to the sort of mission, in the teeth of his own inadequacy, that Moses is now on. God uses inadequate people who walk with him. And then finally in verses 27 to 31, Moses and Aaron meet up, the teams together. The narrative concludes with Moses meeting Aaron as instructed by God, and together they show the Israelites the sign who believe it, worship God, recognizing his concern for their plight. Okay, what are the themes and what are the Bible lessons to learn out of this?
Well, I guess themes in this and theological considerations, the main themes would be God's presence and authority. His presence is the foundation for Moses' mission. I am is with them. Human reluctance against God's call? Yeah, Moses' repeated objections highlight human reluctance in the face of divine calling, contrasting with God's patient reassurance and provision. The theme of covenant and mission. An emphasis on covenant. There's the mention of circumcision and the things that go on there later on in chapter 4. It underscores the importance of obedience to God's commands in fulfilling God's mission. And then there's a theme of prophetic leadership. Moses is established as a prophetic leader who will mediate, be the go-between between God and his people. And those are things you will usually hear said about this passage. It tends to be presented as a dialogue between divine sovereignty and human agency, where God's purposes prevail despite human reluctance. Well, maybe it does have those things in it, but that's possibly missing the powerful, epic point as far as I'm concerned, because this passage reveals profound truths about how God works, particularly in his choice to use weak people, humble people, and those who are reluctant to accomplish his great purposes. The big theme, as far as I can see, is the theme of the weak and the strong, and God choosing the weak rather than a person in a position of human strength to do what it is that God needs to see done. And in a world that often values strength, power, self-sufficiency, God turns these expectations completely upside down. He chooses the weak to confound the strong. Moses in Egypt was at least as weak, but nowhere near so deeply aware of that weakness as he comes to be by this verse. He is the weak one that God the Almighty uses to shame the humanly strong. And the story of Moses is a vivid illustration of this crucial, massively inspiring, divine principle. Moses is a man of weakness and insecurity. At the time of his calling, he is a man who by all accounts is not in a position of strength. He was born a Hebrew slave, raised in the Egyptian palace, eventually fled to the wilderness after killing an Egyptian, and by the time we meet him in Exodus 3, Moses is living as a shepherd in Midian, far removed from the power and prestige of Egypt. He's a man who tried to act in his own strength, and it hadn't gone well, and he ends up having to flee. Now he's an 80-year-old shepherd, seemingly resigned to a life of obscurity. And when God appears to Moses in the burning bush, the encounter is as much about God's power as it is about Moses' weakness. God tells Moses he's seen the suffering of the Israelites, has come to deliver them. And then in a dramatic turn, God commissions Moses to be the one to lead his people to deliverance. And Moses' response is immediate. Who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Exodus 3:11. Moses' first word, his first response, reflects his deep sense of inadequacy. He is keenly aware now of his limitations. He's a fugitive, a shepherd, and by his own admission, slow of speech and tongue. Exodus 4:10. He sees himself as weak, unqualified, and incapable of such a monumental task. But the second thing we then see is God's power being perfected in human weakness. Here's the key point. God does not see Moses' weakness as a problem. In fact, God sees that as the opportunity. The very things that make Moses feel unqualified are the things that qualify him in God's eyes. Why? Because 2 Corinthians 12:9, as the Lord said to Paul the Apostle, God's power is made perfect in weakness. God's response to Moses' objections reveal a deep truth about how God works. And when Moses asks, who am I? God answers, I will be with you. Exodus 3:12. There's the key. God doesn't give Moses a pep talk about his latent potential or try to boost his self-esteem. Instead, God shifts the focus from Moses' inadequacy to God's own sufficiency. I am with you. I will be with you. And the success of the mission doesn't depend on Moses' strength, but on God's presence. And it is always the case. That is always true. It's a theme we see throughout Scripture. God often chooses the weak, the overlooked, the marginalised to carry out his plans, but God is with them. He chose David, young shepherd, to be king of Israel. He chose Mary, a humble young woman, to bear the Saviour of the world. He chose fishermen, tax collectors, sinners to be his disciples. God delights in using the weak to confound the strong because it showcases his power and brings glory to him alone, the only one to whom glory belongs, and slays the myth of human sufficiency. Yeah. What do we got going on? We're seeing Moses, man of weakness and insecurity. We're seeing that the plan is for God's power to be perfected in his weakness, and we're going to see that God equips the called. Doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. See, as the dialogue between God and Moses continues, Moses raises more objections. He worries the Israelites won't believe him or listen to him, Exodus 4:1. He laments his lack of eloquence, Exodus 4:10. And then in desperation, Moses pleads, "Pardon your servant, Lord, please send someone else." Exodus 4:13. But in spite of Moses' reluctance, God doesn't give up on him. Instead, God provides Moses with everything he needs to fulfill his calling. He gives him signs to perform, like turning his staff into a serpent and his hand becoming leprous and then healed. He promises to help Moses speak and teaches him what to say. And when Moses then goes on and insists that he's not the right man for the job, God appoints Aaron, Moses' brother, to speak on his behalf. What we are seeing is that God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. And Moses' weaknesses therefore do not disqualify him for God's service. Instead, they create the perfect backdrop for God's power to be displayed. Moses will go to Pharaoh, but he'll go not in his own strength, but in the strength of the Lord. And because of this, all of Egypt will see the might of the God of Israel. Do you find that inspiring? I find the whole thing very inspiring. You know, track forward a bit in the story. If you know that story, you probably do. All those confrontations with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who had the human power to do terrible things to Moses. Moses took him on. Not the way he'd taken the Egyptian slave driver on earlier in his life in his own strength, but in the confidence that he'd placed and found it was justified to place in the God of the covenant. I am with you. Go forward to the giving of the law on Sinai and the disappointment and the leadership of the people out of that place, and for years and years, 40 years, trekking round the wilderness. One crisis after another. Utterly humanly insufficient, but discovering what Paul writes about our sufficiency being from God. Our weakness turns out to be God's strength. That's what that means for us today. It means we too should not be discouraged by our weaknesses or our inadequacies or our limitations. It's not about us, it's about God with us. And like Moses, we may feel unqualified for the task that God seems to be calling us to do. And we look at our own lives and we think, who am I to do this? As Moses said. But the truth is, it's not about who we are, it's about who God is. And God calls each of us to different roles and different tasks in his kingdom. Some may be called to leadership, others to serve in quiet, unseen ways. But you know this? In every case, God is not looking for the most talented or the most capable. He is looking for those who are willing to trust in him and step out in faith despite their weakness. That's what he's looking for. When we are weak, we're in the perfect position to rely on God's strength. When we acknowledge, that is, our inadequacies, we make room for God's power to work through us. And the Apostle Paul understood that well when he wrote, "For when I'm weak, then I'm strong." 2 Corinthians 12:10. Our weaknesses are not obstacles to God's working through us. They are the opportunity for God's glory to shine through. Okay, so we're getting there now, aren't we? In closing, let's just remember the story of Moses as a reminder that God's ways are not our ways and our limitations are no limitation to him. He chooses the weak to confound the strong, the humble to lead the mighty and the foolish to shame.
the wise. And let's remember the phase of life Moses was in when God met him in this way. See, according to Exodus 7:7, Moses was 80 years old when he confronted Pharaoh. He'd been 40 years in Midian, making his living tending Jethro's flocks, after he'd been in Egypt 40 years as well. So Moses in Egypt, we now know as 40-year-old Moses, strong, educated and skilled. He had political clout, military knowledge, physical gifting, deep sympathy for his people. Surely he's God's man. But he's more his own man than he's God's man at the moment, and that's no good. So it all unravels for 40-year-old Moses. The people reject him. Pharaoh wants him killed. He's left with no other option but to flee to the wilderness. And God does his best work on his people in the wilderness. Really looks like that. Until 80-year-old Moses, the immense contrast with that early picture is ready. And at that point, God meets Moses in that burning bush. And by now, octogenarian Moses knows he's weak. He can't even talk well, and he just longs that somebody else would be sent. Moses has actually made this transition from "it makes sense that God would use me" to "who am I that God would use me?" And in that change of attitude and self-awareness, he demonstrates that he's now ready. God has deconstructed Moses' so-called strengths so that he will learn who's really in control and find that in faithful dependence on God is where his strength lies, his ability lies. He doesn't march into Egypt with an elaborate military strategy. He doesn't waltz in with an arsenal of sophisticated weapons to arm an enslaved nation for rebellion. He limps in with a stutter and a stick. And through him, God will overthrow the world's mightiest nation and redeem his people. The Lord chooses the 80-year-old, not the 40-year-old, because the older Moses knows his weakness is the platform for God's strength. God doesn't need our impressiveness. He uses broken jars of clay. 2 Corinthians 4:7. People who, like Moses, ask, "Who am I that you would use me?" And it's there, in that confession of weakness, that his power is perfected, his glory revealed, his grace radiant. And internalizing that awareness frees us. The point that should inspire us is that if God could use that sort of weak Moses, a reluctant and insecure shepherd, to deliver an entire nation, then he can use us, weaknesses and all, for his purposes. And we will feel inadequate. And we will doubt our ability to fulfill God's call. Take heart, you're in good company. Trust in God's presence, rely on his strength, step out in faith in him. It's when our vision of God's glory has been seen in the face of Jesus Christ, and like Paul, our eyeballs have been seared by the glory of that sight. Then it is, in our weakness, that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. Then it is that his glory is revealed.